I have told this story to exactly one man before tonight. Old Pruitt, who handled my remuda for 3 years up on the Broken Bow Range, and who had the good sense to listen without interrupting. He said when I finished, "Cord, that is the longest way a man ever rode to get back to a woman who was already waiting." I told him she wasn't waiting in the usual sense of the word. He said that didn't change anything. He was right, and I have had cause to know it every morning for 9 years since. But I am getting ahead of myself. That is the curse of a man telling a story he has lived. He knows the end before he starts, and the end is the only part he ever really wants to say. Let me go back to where it began, which was not the beginning I would have chosen. I rode out of Quarry Ford on the last Thursday in October, 5 years before I rode back in. It was 3 o'clock in the morning, which is the hour a man rides out of a place when he has no good defense and no friends willing to stand up and say so in public. There were 11 people in Quarry Ford who knew the survey records I'd been accused of falsifying were clean when I submitted them. Not one of them said a word in the 4 days between the accusation and the morning Burl Ness's brother, who was also the county magistrate, told me to retain a lawyer or expect an arrest order by Friday. I was 29 years old. I had $112, a sound horse, my surveying instruments, and a knowledge of territorial land law that hadn't done me a lick of good in the preceding 4 days. I did the mathematics of it in about 2 minutes and rode north. I want to be honest about what I was and wasn't that night. I wasn't a coward. I had thought hard about staying, about standing trial, about believing that the truth had a fair chance in a county where the magistrate was the brother of the man who'd forged the records and pinned the forgery on me. I decided the truth did not have a fair chance in that particular county at that particular time, and I was right. I found that out later, from a distance. What I was that night was a man who had run out of options, and who knew it, and who made the only calculation still available to him. I rode north. What I was also, and this I am less comfortable admitting, but it is the truth, and this story requires it, was a man who rode away from the one person in Quarry Ford who had stood at her freight depot door on the day of the accusation and looked at me with an expression that was not pity, not doubt, and not the careful blankness that the other 10 people wore when they were trying to stay clear of the trouble. Willa Dent had looked at me the way a woman looks at a man when she has already decided what she thinks, and the rest of the county can take its time catching up. I had seen that look. I had understood it. And I had ridden north anyway, because I had nothing left to offer her, and I was not going to stand in a woman's doorway empty-handed and ask her to vouch for a man who couldn't prove a thing. That was my reasoning, and I believe it was honorable. I also believe, having had 9 years to consider it from the other side, that it was slightly wrong. But a man can only make the calculation that is in front of him with the numbers he has at the time. The fraud itself, I should explain, was not a complicated thing, not in the criminal sense. Burl Ness ran the Quarry Ford land office and had been running it for 6 years before I came to the county as the contracted territorial surveyor. His particular corruption was the slow, careful kind. He had been adjusting easement filing records on freight routes for years, shaving the boundary lines in ways that shifted the legal width of those routes, which affected the rate structures that freighters could charge. The affected routes ran through land that abutted his family's ranch holdings. The adjustments were small enough, year by year, that no one who wasn't reading the original survey records against the filed records would catch them. I caught them in my second month, because I was rerunning a boundary line on one of those routes for a routine update, and the benchmarks I set did not match the filed dimensions by enough that I noticed. I put it in my report. I flagged the discrepancy. I sent the report through proper channels, which meant through the county land office, which meant through Burl Ness. 4 weeks later, the easement filing records that I had flagged showed a correction, but the correction was attributed to falsification by the contracted surveyor, meaning me, and the corrected records showed the boundaries shifted back to Ness's adjusted version. My original flag was gone from the file. In its place was a notation, in the land office clerk's hand, stating that the original survey submission from the contracted surveyor had contained material errors that had been identified and referred for review. That was Wednesday. On Thursday, Ness came to my office with 2 witnesses and told me that the Territorial Surveyor's Office had been notified of the discrepancies and that a review had been requested. He said it with the particular ease of a man who has done this before, or who has arranged it carefully enough that he is very sure of the outcome. I told him the records he was citing were not the records I had submitted. He said he was sorry to hear I was taking that position. On Friday, the magistrate, his brother, sent the message about retaining a lawyer. I spent Saturday and Sunday going through everything I still had, which was my field notes and my raw measurements, and the carbon copy of the original survey report I had retained according to standard practice. They were enough to show any competent examiner that my figures were correct, and the filed records had been changed. They were not enough to bring before a magistrate whose brother had arranged the change. On Sunday night, I packed my instruments and wrote out a full account of everything I knew, and sealed it in an envelope addressed to the Territorial Surveyor's office in the capital. I left the envelope with the postmaster, who was a man named Garrett Flint, and who had no connection to Ness, and who I trusted to see it properly sent. Then I went back to my room and sat for a while, and I thought about the next morning and the various ways it could go. In the end, I thought about Willa Dent's face. I thought about riding out to the freight depot in the dark and knocking on that door and telling her what I was going to do. I thought about what she would say. I thought about what I would say back. And I understood that I could not make that conversation do anything useful. Not for her. Not for the freight company she was running alone since her father's death. Not for the easement lines that Ness's fraud had been quietly stealing from her for years. I would be putting the trouble in her doorway. I was not willing to do that. At 3 o'clock in the morning, I saddled my horse and rode north. I will tell you that I thought about her every day for the first 3 months, and then every few days for the year after that, and then, with the steadier, quieter frequency that a man thinks about a thing he has set down but not put away. It was not a consuming grief. It was more like a fixed point, something I knew the position of, something I could take a bearing on when I needed to know where I was. The 5 years I spent away from Quarry Ford are not the story, but they are the frame of it, so I will give them their due. I went north and then west. I hired on as a survey hand on a railroad right-of-way crew in the Crest River country, which was far enough from Quarry Ford that no one had heard of me, and close enough to the kind of work I knew to let me do it well. I did it very well. Within 8 months, I was the lead surveyor on that crew, and within 2 years, I was running my own contract work for the Territorial Land Office in Crest River County. That office was run by a man named Aldous Birch, who was everything that Burl Ness was not: methodical, square-dealing, and constitutionally incapable of looking the other way when something did not add up. Aldous ran a tight office. His clerks filed records the same hour they received them. His survey contracts were reviewed by 2 people before they were accepted. He had a method for cross-checking boundary markers against the original field notes that he had devised himself, and that caught 3 errors in my first year of work with him, 1 of them mine, 2 of them his predecessors. He acknowledged all 3 in the same tone of voice, and without distinguishing between whose error was whose, which told me more about his character than most men's behavior over years. It was Aldous who first heard me out, in the 2nd year, when I told him about Quarry Ford. He listened the way a good man listens, without hurrying to either believe or disbelieve, just letting the thing land and then sitting with it. He asked 2 questions. The first was about the specific nature of the discrepancy I had found and flagged. The second was about the date of the magistrate's letter. I answered both precisely, because I had kept the dates in my head the way a surveyor keeps a boundary point, not with effort, just with the habit of precision that is the only thing standing between a survey and a lawsuit. The forged records would still be on file, he said when I finished. They would. And the actual surveys you submitted? Filed with the same office, the same date. Ness needed a scapegoat for the land grab, because the property lines in question touched 2 freight route easements, the Dent family's easements. Aldous set down his pen. Dent freight out of Quarry Ford? The same. He was quiet for a moment. I know the Quarry Ford Land Office records, he said. I audited that district 3 years ago. There were irregularities on those easement filings that I flagged, and that were subsequently explained away by the district magistrate. He picked up his pen again. I would like to look at this again. That conversation was the beginning of the end of Burl Ness's land fraud, though it took another 1.5 years, and the testimony of a title examiner from the territorial capital, before the thing was formally corrected. The audit found what Aldous had half expected to find: a pattern of small adjustments across 6 years of easement filings, all of them consistent with a single hand and a single purpose. The title examiner compared the filed records against the field notes I had retained, and against 4 other surveyors' original submissions, all of which had undergone similar quiet revisions. The Attorney General's office took formal notice. A letter was sent to the Quarry Ford County magistrate, who was by that point a different man from the one who had threatened me with arrest. That man, the old magistrate, had resigned 18 months earlier, quietly and quickly, when Aldis's initial audit report began circulating through the territorial system. When the corrected record was filed with the amended notation, Ness's name where mine had been, the original survey figures restored, the material error attribution retracted, I was given a certified copy by the Territorial Records Office. The Attorney General's letter to the new magistrate in Quarry Ford was sent at the same time. I held that certified copy in my hands for a long time the night I received it. I had been thinking about what to do with it. The rational thing was to stay in Crest River County, where I had a contract and a reputation, and no complicated history. The rational thing was to send the certified copy by post and let the legal machinery run without me in the middle of it. I had a good life in Crest River County. I had done the work. I had corrected the record. The law was doing the rest. I had been telling myself this for about 3 weeks when I finally admitted to myself that the reason I was still thinking about Quarry Ford was not the land records. The land records were the excuse. The reason was a freight depot door and a look that had never quite let go of me. I packed my instruments and what I owned into my saddlebags, gave Aldis Birch a month's notice, and rode south. He walked me to my horse on the morning I left. We shook hands. He said, "The district contract here is yours to come back to, if it doesn't go the way you want." I told him I was obliged to him. He said, "Don't thank me. You did the work." That was Aldis all over. No more words than the thing required, and all of them exactly right. It was September, early in the month, when I came back into the Quarry Ford country. The high plains were still summer gold at the edges and going dry at the roots, the way they do when the first real cold is still 3 weeks out, but the grass already knows. I came in from the north on the freight road, which was the long way around, and which I had chosen deliberately because it brought me past the old survey lines I had run 6 years before the accusation, the ones that were now correctly filed in the territorial record. I wanted to see them with my own eyes. I rode the line for 2 hours in the morning, and everything was where I had put it, and the land was exactly as I had measured it, and I will not pretend that did not mean something to me. I came into Quarry Ford just after noon. The town had not changed in any way that mattered. Frontier towns do not change quickly. They either die or they calcify, and Quarry Ford had chosen to calcify. The main street was the same width and the same length, and had the same 3 establishments anchoring it that had anchored it when I left. The Drover's Supply on the west end, the land office on the east end, and Kell's Saloon in the middle. The freight depot sat a quarter-mile south of the main street on the river road, which was where it had always been, and which was where I had always understood Willa Dent to be the true center of the commerce of the county, even if the county had not always understood this about itself. I stopped first at the land office. I want to be clear about this, because there were people in Quarry Ford who later implied I had come back for other reasons, and while they were not entirely wrong, the legal matter was real, and it was first. The new district magistrate was a man named Fen Cawley, who had been appointed from the territorial capital after the previous magistrate resigned. Cawley was a careful, quiet man of about 50, who wore his spectacles on the end of his nose and read everything twice before he said a word about it. I spread the certified copy and the Territorial Attorney General's letter on his desk and stood back and let him read. He read everything twice. Then he set the papers down, removed his spectacles, and looked at me. "Mr. Haley," he said, "I owe you an official statement of correction and an apology on behalf of this office." "The statement is enough," I said. "I didn't come back for the apology." He nodded, as if that was what he expected. "The Ness matter has been referred to the Territorial Attorney's Office for formal prosecution. You should know that." "I know it. I had a hand in getting it there." "Yes," he said. "Aldis Birch mentioned you in his report." He set the papers in a neat pile. "You're a surveyor." "I am." "This district," he said carefully, "does not currently have a contracted surveyor." I looked at him. "I'll consider it," I said. He nodded again. I picked up my hat and walked out. I will tell you what happened when I walked up the main street of Quarry Ford after that, because it is part of the story, and it would be dishonest to leave it out. 3 men I had known before I left crossed to the other side of the street when they saw me coming. One woman I had known, whose name I will not give because she has since done better by me, turned into the dry goods store before I reached her. A boy of about 14, who had been 8 when I left, looked at me with frank curiosity and no judgment whatsoever, and I found myself grateful for that, in a way I had not expected to be grateful for anything in Quarry Ford. A man I did not recognize at all, broad, dark, about 35, came out of Kells, stopped on the boardwalk, and looked at me steady. Then he said, "You're Haley." "I am." "I heard about the Ness records," he said. "Word gets around in a land office county." He put out his hand. "Dalt Pruitt. I run the freighting south of the river." I shook his hand. "Competing with Dent Freight?" I said. He smiled, a little wry. "Nobody competes with Dent Freight. I go where Willa doesn't go, and I send her anything she ought to be handling." He looked at me a moment more. "She kept that operation running," he said, "through the easement trouble, and the 3 years the county was trying to refile the route permissions. You should know that." "I do know it," I said, though I hadn't known the details. "Good," he said. He went back inside. I walked the rest of the main street and turned south on the river road. The Dent Freight Depot had been built by Willa's father, Amos Dent, in the early 70s. Amos had died 2 years before my trouble, of a fever that hit the county in late winter, and did not play favorites. He had left the depot to Willa, who was the only child, and who had been running the books and most of the operations for 3 years before Amos died anyway. The depot was a long, low building with a wide loading dock on the riverside and a small office on the roadside, and Amos had built it to last, which it had. The sign over the roadside door said Dent Freight in painted letters that had been touched up recently. The paint was newer than the wood, and there were 2 wagons in the yard with their harness neatly racked, and a third being loaded by a man whose back was to me. I stopped my horse at the yard gate and sat there a moment. I had ridden 500 miles for this. I had spent 1.5 years working through the territorial legal system for this. I had spent 5 years building the kind of record that entitled me to walk through that gate without apology. And now I was sitting at the gate like a man who had arrived somewhere and was not certain it was the right address. I dismounted, looped the reins around the gate post, and walked to the office door. I knocked on the frame, which was the thing a man did at Dent Freight. Amos had kept a sign that said "Knock and wait," and although the sign was gone, the habit had stuck in me. "It's open," said a voice from inside. I went in. Willa Dent was standing at the far end of the desk, with a ledger open in front of her and a pencil behind her ear, and she was looking at a column of figures with the expression of a woman who has found an error and is deciding whether it is her error or the other party's error. She did not look up immediately. She was wearing a plain work dress of dark blue wool, and her hair was pinned up, and there was a smudge of pencil on the side of her hand. She was 38 years old, which I knew because she was a year younger than me, and she looked exactly like herself, which is to say, she looked nothing like the softened, simplified version of her I had been carrying around in my head for 5 years. The actual Willa was always more angular and more direct than the memory of her, and seeing her standing there in the flat afternoon light with a pencil behind her ear made 5 years collapse into nothing in the space of about 3 seconds. Then she looked up. She looked at me the same way she had looked at me on the day of the accusation, 5 years before. Not with surprise, not with relief, not with any of the complicated emotions I had been bracing for, but with the steady, level attention of a woman who has already formed her opinion and is simply confirming it against the evidence in front of her. "Cord Haley," she said. "Willa." She looked back at her ledger for 1 more second, made a small mark with her pencil, and closed it. "I heard the Ness records were corrected," she said. "Fen Cawley sent me a copy of the amended easement filing last month. He mentioned he would." "He did?" She tilted her head slightly. "When did you talk to Cawley?" "About an hour ago." "Ah." She took the pencil from behind her ear and set it on the desk. "You went to the land office first. The legal matter was first." The corner of her mouth moved, not quite a smile. "Of course it was," she said. She crossed around the desk and stood about 4 feet from me, and she looked at me, The way you look at a man you are reading for the truth. You look different, she said. Older. 5 years tends to do that. Thinner, she said. And you have that line here. She touched the corner of her own eye, briefly. That's a line a man gets from squinting into the sun for too long. Or from worrying. Which was it? Both, I said. She nodded as if she expected that too. Are you back, she said, or are you passing through? That depends, I said, on a few things I don't know yet. She was quiet for a moment. The sound of the man loading the wagon came through the open door, the thump and scrape of freight crates being settled into place. Sit down, she said. I'll put the coffee on. I sat down in the chair across from her desk, the wooden one, with the straight back that had been Amos Dent's chair for visitors, and I heard her move to the small iron stove at the back of the office. I heard the sound of water from a pitcher, and the sound of the coffee pot being settled on the stove plate. Then she came back and sat down across from me, and we looked at each other in the honest way of two people who have not seen each other in a long time, and who are deciding, quietly and without fanfare, what the other person amounts to now. Tell me, she said. All of it, from the beginning. So I did. I told her about riding north in the dark, and about the Crest River country, and about Aldous Birch, and the audit, and the long, careful process of getting the territorial record corrected. I told her about the 1.5 years of legal work, and the title examiner's testimony, and the Attorney General's letter. I told it plainly, in the order it happened, and she listened, the way she always listened, without filler, without the small sounds people make to indicate they are following along, just quiet and attentive, and letting every word find its place. The coffee pot began to make its sounds behind her. The man in the yard finished loading, and called out that the run to Millbrook was ready, and she called back, "Take Jem, I'll do the manifest when you're back," without taking her eyes off me. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Outside, the afternoon was going long and golden through the roadside window, and I could hear the wagon pulling out of the yard, and the particular sound that a loaded freight wagon makes on dry ground, which is a low, solid rolling that you feel before you hear it. Then she said, "I know." I looked at her. "I always knew," she said, "that the records were forged, that Ness needed a route to the easement fraud, and you were the easiest man to put in the way of it." She paused. I looked at those original survey filings myself. I have a freight company. I read survey filings the way you read land law. The benchmarks were right. The boundary markers were right. The declination adjustments were right. Burl Ness's version had all the same numbers, except the ones that had to change to move the easement line, and even those were done clumsily. She shook her head slightly. It was not a good forgery. It was just a forgery done by a man who knew the magistrate would not look too hard. I was quiet for a moment. There was something strange happening inside my chest, which I took a moment to identify. It was the particular feeling of a weight being set down. Not suddenly, the way a dropped stone lands, but slowly, the way a heavy man lowers himself into a chair when he has been standing for a long time. "You knew," I said. "I knew. And you said nothing." She met my eyes. "I said it to 2 people," she said. "I said it to your predecessor at the land office, who told me it was a legal matter and not a freight matter, and I should mind my business. And I said it to Amos Dent's old friend, Judge Garrett, who had retired to his farm east of town by then, and had no standing in the county court." She paused. "Garrett said the same thing you said, that the truth did not have a fair chance in that county at that time. He wrote to the territorial capital, but the letter went to the wrong office and was misrouted, and by the time it could have done any good, you were already gone." I looked at the desk. "I should have stayed," I said. "Maybe," she said. "But you didn't know any of that, and you were 29, and you had just been told to get a lawyer or expect an arrest order, and the magistrate was Ness's brother." She reached past me and brought out 2 tin cups from the shelf behind my head, which meant she had to lean close enough that I could smell the cedar soap she used. She set both cups on the desk. "You made the calculation you could make. It was not a wrong calculation. I left without saying a word to you." She went to the stove and poured the coffee. "No," she said, not looking at me. "You did not." She came back with both cups and set one in front of me, and sat down with the other. "I will tell you," she said, "that I was angry about that for some time. Not because I expected you to stay. I understood why you went. But because you did not say goodbye. I know, I said. That was wrong. I have thought about it a great deal. She looked at me over the rim of her cup. All right, she said. All right? All right. She took a sip of her coffee. You have thought about it a great deal. That's the beginning and the end of that, unless you'd like to make a longer speech about it, in which case I will listen, but I will not enjoy it as much as the coffee. I looked at her. That line, the corner of her mouth moving, was almost a smile again. No longer speech, I said. Good. We sat with our coffee. Through the open door, the afternoon light was making long patterns across the plank floor. Somewhere across the yard, a horse shook its harness and stamped once. It was a very ordinary moment, and it was entirely outside of anything I had rehearsed on the ride south from Crest River County. Dalt Pruitt told me you kept the operation running, I said, through the easement trouble. Dalt Pruitt talks too much, she said, without heat. But yes, it was 3 years of the county trying to refile the easement permissions under a different name, which would have changed the route rates and done considerable damage to anyone running freight on this road. She set her cup down. I went to the territorial capital twice. Both times I came back with something I could use. By the 3rd year the new county magistrate was in place, and the amended filings were already working their way through the territorial office, and it was clear enough that the thing was going to resolve correctly that the county backed down. You did that alone, I said. She looked at me steadily. I run a freight company alone, she said. It is my company. It was the easement to my route. What would you have had me do? I shook my head. Nothing different. I'm not suggesting anything different. Good, she said again. She picked up her cup. Then she said, more quietly, there were 3 men who asked to marry me in those 5 years. I looked at my coffee. I said no to all 3, she said. Not because I was waiting for you. I want to be clear about that. I said no because they were not the right men, and I had a freight company to run, and I did not feel the want of a marriage for its own sake strongly enough to take a practical arrangement. That is the honest account. She paused. I am giving you the honest account because you came back and you are sitting in Amos's chair, which no one has sat in since Amos, because I never offered it, and that tells me something about why you came back. And I would rather have the truth on the table than dance around it until we are both too tired to say anything useful. I was quiet for a moment. Outside, a horse came into the yard, and one of the depot's hired hands called out something about a late Millbrook freight that needed to be rerouted. The legal matter was first, I said again. That part I told you was true. I believe you. But it was not, I said, the only reason I came back. She looked at me. She did not look surprised, or afraid, or pleased in any obvious way. She just looked at me with that steady attention she had, the one that made a man feel he was being read correctly and needed to make sure what he said was true. I spent 5 years, I said, doing what I should have been doing in Quarry Ford, which was building a record worth standing on. I had the work. I had the skills. I did not have a reason to care about doing it, except the hope of coming back here with something to show for it. Whether that was wise or foolish depends on what you say next, and I know that. And I am telling you anyway, because you said you wanted the truth on the table. Willa Dent looked at me for a long moment. Where are you staying? She said. I have not arranged a room yet. Kells has rooms, she said. They are not good rooms, but they are clean enough. Stay there tonight. She stood and took her ledger from the desk. Come back tomorrow morning. I have a freight manifest that needs a second set of eyes. And there is a route line east of the river that I have been meaning to have properly rerun for 2 years, and the man who would have done it correctly is sitting in front of me. She looked at me over the ledger. Can you still run a boundary survey? Better than I could 5 years ago. Then come back tomorrow morning, she said. Bring your instruments. I stood and took my hat. I looked at her for a moment, this particular woman, in this particular light, with her ledger and her pencil, and the smudge on the side of her hand, and the coffee still warm in the pot behind her, and I thought, this is the whole reason. All right, I said. All right, she said. I walked back out through the freight yard and mounted my horse, and rode back toward the main street of Quarry Ford to find a room at Kells, and I will tell you that I rode that quarter mile with something in my chest that I had not had in 5 years. which was the feeling of a man who knows where he is going in the morning. I will not make a long story of the weeks that followed, though they deserve to be told with some care, because they were the weeks in which everything that mattered was actually built. Not in a speech or a moment, but in the way things are built on the frontier, which is slowly and with a great deal of ordinary work done side by side. I took the room at Kell's, and I came back in the morning with my instruments. The freight manifest she had mentioned turned out to be a disputed boundary line on a parcel east of the river that touched one of the Dent route easements, and the dispute had been running for 2 years because no one had run a proper independent survey. I spent 4 days on it. The ground out there was rocky limestone shelf with a creek that shifted every spring, which meant the original benchmarks had to be found by reading the geology rather than the stakes, because the stakes had long since been pulled or moved. I found them. The boundary was where Willa said it was, and not where the other party claimed, and when I filed the survey report with Fen Colley at the land office, he looked at it, looked at me over his spectacles, and said, "You are very thorough." "Survey work tends to need to be," I said. "I will be making that contract offer formally next week," he said. I told him I would be waiting for it. I was in the Dent Freight office when I was not in the field. Willa had not asked me to be there. I had simply found that there were things I could be useful for, not the freight work, which was hers, and which she ran as well as any man I had seen run anything, but the land law questions that kept arising from the route easements, which were complex, and which she understood in practical terms, but for which she sometimes wanted a second reading of the statute. I read statutes, she asked questions. We disagreed, occasionally, about the correct interpretation of a particular clause, and I learned early that Willa Dent, disagreeing with you, was not an unpleasant experience, so long as you were willing to show your reasoning and listen to hers, which was usually sound. There was a statute about easement rate adjustments on surveyed routes that she had been interpreting one way, and I interpreted another, and we spent most of a Thursday afternoon on it, each of us with the relevant sections open on the desk, and the primary reference texts open beside them. By the end of the afternoon she had conceded 1 point and I had conceded 2, and the correct reading turned out to be a third interpretation that neither of us had started with, which we arrived at together by going back to the original legislative session notes. She wrote the correct interpretation into the margin of her rate schedule in her very precise hand. She did not say I was helpful. She went to put the kettle on, which was the same thing. Those afternoons taught me something about the particular quality of Willa's mind, which I had sensed in the years before my trouble, but had not had the occasion to see fully at work. She did not think in the way that many capable people think, building a conclusion first, and then looking for support to hold it up. She thought the other way. She gathered everything available, set it out in front of her, and let the conclusion form from the evidence. It was slower. It was right, more often. When she changed her position, which she did without difficulty, when the evidence warranted it, there was no ceremony to it. She simply wrote the new number in the margin and moved on. I found this more admirable than I had words for at the time, and I told her so one evening, when the freight route question had been running for the better part of 2 days, and had arrived at an answer that cost her money in the short term and protected her route in the long term. She looked at me across the desk. "I am not doing you a favor by thinking clearly," she said. "I am doing myself one." "I know it," I said. "I am not saying it as a compliment. I am saying it because it is what I observed." She looked at me for a moment more. In that way she had. "All right," she said. She went back to the rate schedule. That was the end of it, and it was enough. There were evenings I stayed for supper, which happened because the day ran long and there was food on the stove, and it would have been wasteful to leave. The depot had a table in the back room that Amos had built for the purpose, a long plank table that seated 6, and on the evenings I stayed, it was usually Willa and me, and 2 of the hired hands, a man named Jem Carrick, who had driven freight for Amos, and continued driving for Willa without any change in his demeanor at the changeover, and a younger man named Pell, who was about 22, and who was the most methodical freight loader I had ever seen, and who had the habit of reciting, under his breath, every item on the manifest as he loaded it. Jem and Pell treated my presence at the supper table with the particular incuriosity of men who are accustomed to the freight depot being the center of everything that happens in the county, and who have therefore seen most things already and do not find new things remarkable. They ate and talked about the route conditions and the weather and the state of the South Road with the attentiveness of men for whom these were the genuinely important questions of the day, which they were. I ate and listened and answered when something touched on the land law or the surveying, and the evenings went the way that working evenings go, quietly, practically, with the satisfaction of people who have done a day's work and are honestly tired. Willa presided over these evenings the way she presided over everything at the depot, which was without presiding. She ate. She listened. She asked Jem about the Millbrook Road condition and Pell about the manifests for the coming week. Once or twice she caught me looking at her across the table, with an expression I was not controlling as carefully as I should have been, and she looked back at me with a steadiness that was not discouragement, and was not encouragement, and was simply the honest acknowledgement of the fact, which was what Willa did with most things. Walking back to Kells on those evenings, through the cool September dark of the river road, I thought about the calculation I had made 5 years ago, and about the calculation I was making now, and about how much simpler the second one was than the first. The first had been made in fear and haste, and with no good options. The second was being made in something like clarity, and what it kept arriving at, every time I ran it, was the same answer. It was in those afternoons that I understood what I had already suspected, that the version of Willa Dent I had been carrying around in my head for 5 years was not wrong so much as it was thin. I had remembered her steadiness and her intelligence and the quality of her attention, and those things were all as I had remembered them. What I had not fully known was the sheer scope of the work she had done, not just the freight operation, but the legal fighting through the easement trouble, the twice-made trip to the territorial capital, the years of keeping the route permissions from being quietly rewritten out from under her. She had done all of this alone, and she had done it without complaint and without sentiment, and she would not have called it remarkable if you asked her. She would have said it was her company and her route, and there was nothing remarkable about fighting for your own. The Ness matter moved through the territorial court on its own schedule, which I could not hurry, and did not try to. The county heard about it. In a place like Quarry Ford, the county hears about everything, and the hearing of it produced a quiet reshuffling of opinions that I observed without commenting on. The 3 men who had crossed the street when I walked up it on my first day back did not cross the street anymore. The woman who had turned into the dry goods store nodded to me from across the way about 3 weeks in. Dalt Pruitt came by the land office twice to talk freight route coordination with me, which was more properly Willa's conversation, and I told him so each time, and each time he grinned in a way that suggested he knew that, and had come to see me anyway. A man named Brig Coston, who had been one of the witnesses Ness brought to my office on the day of the accusation, came to find me one morning, outside Kells. He was about 60 now, weathered down to the bone, and he stood there with his hat in his hands, looking at me, with the expression of a man who has rehearsed something, and is not certain he is going to say it the way he intended. He said, "I want to say I was wrong not to speak." I looked at him. "I knew the records were wrong," he said. "Ness told me there'd been a clerical mix-up and he needed a couple of men to stand and say the matter had been reviewed. I didn't know until later that it was what it was." He looked at his hat. "When I knew what it was, I did not correct myself. I should have." I thought about this for a moment. "Why are you telling me this now?" I said. "Because you came back," he said, "and you went to the land office first, and the whole county knows what you brought with you, and I have had to look at myself in that regard every morning since you rode in. I am telling you because it needed to be said, and because I am the one who needed to say it." I looked at him for a long moment. He was not a bad man. I had known that when it happened. He was a man who had been used by a worse one, and who had, when pushed, made a choice that cost someone else, and not himself, and who had been living with that ever since, in the particular way a man lives with a thing he cannot correct. "All right," I said. He put his hat back on and walked away. I stood for a moment outside Kells in the morning light, and thought about the various ways 5 years rearranges a place, and then I went to the freight depot. There was a morning in early October, perhaps 5 weeks after I rode back into Quarry Ford, when I came to the depot at the usual time and found Willa at the loading dock instead of the office. She was inspecting a wheel on one of the big freight wagons, and she had found something she did not like, because she was crouching down beside it with the focused look she had when something was wrong, and she was going to find exactly where. I crouched down beside her. The wheel had a crack in the spoke, small but deepening toward the hub. "That needs to come off," I said. "I know it needs to come off," she said. "The question is whether it needs a new spoke or a new wheel. New spoke will hold for this season. New wheel is the right answer for next spring." She looked at it a moment more. "New spoke," she said, "then new wheel in April." She stood and I stood, and we were standing closer than the usual 4 feet. She looked at me. "Cord," she said. "Yes. Why are you still in Kel's room?" I looked at her. "You have been in Quarry Ford for 5 weeks," she said. "Fen Cawley made you the district surveyor contract 3 weeks ago. You are at this depot 6 days a week. You eat supper here 4 nights out of 7. She looked at me steadily. "You came back for the legal matter, and for a reason that you put on the table 5 weeks ago. The legal matter is resolved. The other reason is standing in front of you. I am asking why you are still staying at Kel's." I looked at this woman, the freight company and the ledger and the pencil behind her ear, and 5 years of Quarry Ford, held together by her precision and her stubbornness and her plain good sense. And I thought about all the ways a man can make a speech at a moment like this, and about how Willa Dent had already told me that she preferred the coffee to the speech. "I did not want to presume," I said. She looked at me a moment longer. Then she turned and walked back into the freight office. I heard her put the kettle on the stove. I heard the particular sound of the kettle being settled correctly on the plate, which was a sound I had heard every morning for 5 weeks, and which I had come to understand was as close to a welcome as the Dent freight office had an idiom for. I followed her in. She was standing at the stove with her back to me, and without turning around she said, "There is a room above the tack shed. It is not much of a room, but it has a window on the south side, and it has been empty since Amos's time. I have been meaning to do something with it." A pause. "I am not telling you what to do with it. I am telling you it exists." I looked at the back of her head. "I understand." "Good." She turned around. "Now, the Millbrook run has a revised rate schedule that I want you to look at before I file it with the county, because there is a territorial regulation about freight route pricing on surveyed easements that I am not certain I am reading correctly." She handed me the ledger. I took it. We sat down on either side of the desk in the flat morning light, with the coffee warming on the stove and the sound of the yard coming in through the open door, and we went through the rate schedule line by line. I moved into the room above the tack shed the following Saturday. I am not a man who is built for the long, articulate declaration of feeling. Willa would tell you the same thing, and she would tell you it without apology, because she is not built for it either. What we are built for, both of us, is the steady daily choosing, the root problem at breakfast, the statute question in the afternoon, the survey line east of the river, the busted spoke, and the calculation about what kind of repair it wants and when. We are built for showing up and doing the work, and coming back the next morning and doing it again. And somewhere in the middle of all that ordinary choosing, the choice itself gets made. There was a Saturday in late October when I came down from the room above the tack shed, before first light, and found Willa, already at the stove, with the coffee started, reading the week's manifests by the lamp. She did not look up when I came in. She said, "The Ridgeback Crossing freight is behind by 2 days. Wet season on the South Road." She turned a page. "Dalt will reroute it through the north, but the north adds half a day, and the client is going to argue about the rate adjustment." "The contract has a weather clause," I said. "I know it has a weather clause." She turned another page. "I need to know the exact wording of the weather clause." I went to the shelf where she kept the contract files, found the Ridgeback Crossing contract, and read her the weather clause. She made a note in her margin. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat down across from her. We sat there in the lamplight before the sun came up, with the manifests between us and the sound of the yard horses moving in the barn, and it was entirely ordinary and entirely right, and I understood that this was the thing I had been riding toward for 5 years without knowing how to name it. We were married in December, 2 months after I moved into the room above the tack shed. Fen Cawley witnessed it. Dalt Pruitt attended, and brought a bottle of something he claimed came from the territorial capital, which I had no reason to dispute. The boy who had watched me walk up the main street on my first day back, his name was Otto, and he was Dalt's nephew, attended also, and ate more of the wedding supper than any 3 adults, and seemed entirely satisfied with the whole proceeding. Brig Costin came and stood at the back of the room and did not say anything to either of us, but he stayed until the end, which I took as the available gesture from him, and which was enough. I have been the district surveyor of Quarry Ford County for 9 years now. I run my boundaries clean, and I file my records correctly, and I have not once had cause to doubt that the record I carry will say what I said it says. Willa runs Dent Freight, which is now larger than it was, and which has a second yard on the Millbrook Road that we put up 3 years ago. I handle the easement law when it comes up, which is often. She handles the freight and the numbers, which is always. The room above the tack shed, it turned out, had a south window that let in a great deal of light in the mornings. We did not stay in it long. By the second spring, we had built out the far end of the depot building proper, which had the space for it and the better light for 2 desks. But I think of that room sometimes. I think of the first morning I woke up in it, with the south light coming in, and the sound of the yard starting up below, and Willa's voice somewhere downstairs already reading the freight manifest for the day, in that tone she has when she is reading something to herself and finding everything in order. Old Pruitt was right. It was the longest way a man ever rode to get back to a woman who was already waiting. But she was not waiting in the way that word usually means, not holding herself in suspension, not putting her life on the shelf until some man came back to take it off again. She was living. She was running the freighting and fighting the county over the easement lines and turning down the wrong men for the right reasons. She was exactly herself, and she had been exactly herself for 5 years. And when I walked into that office with my hat in my hand and my legal papers in my saddlebag and 5 years of deliberate, careful rebuilding behind me, she looked up from her ledger and said my name and then went back to the figures for 1 more second, because she had an error to find. That is the kind of woman she is. When I finished telling all of this to old Pruitt, up on the Broken Bow Range, he poured himself another cup of coffee from the fire and sat with it for a while. Then he said, "The room above the tack shed." "Yes." "She told you about it," he said, "before you asked." "She did. And you understood what that meant." "I did." He nodded slowly. "Well," he said, "that's the whole of it, I suppose." "It is. That is exactly the whole of it. The south light in the morning, and the coffee on the stove, and the sound of Willa Dent reading a manifest to herself and finding everything in order. That is the whole of the thing, and I have never seen any reason to want more from a life than that.